I want you to imagine something for a second. Just picture it. You are at 24,000 feet. The air is so thin it hurts to breathe, it's freezing cold, and your hands are clamped tight around the stick of a Messerschmitt fighter. You look up, and the sky just isn't blue anymore. From one horizon to the other, it's become a moving, shimmering river of aluminum. This isn't just another battle. For you, in this single terrifying moment, it's a revelation. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and see exactly how the world's most elite pilots witness their own defeat. Not in the fire and fury of a dogfight, but in the cold, hard, unavoidable math of the factory floor.
So here's the journey we're going on together. We're going to start with that feeling, that visceral moment of shock, and ask, what did it actually feel like for these pilots to watch the sky turn from blue to silver? Then, we'll dig into the awful arithmetic that made it all possible. After that, we have to ask the hard question. How did that math turn the world's best pilots into victims? We'll see why they began to feel like this wasn't war, but an industrial execution. And finally, maybe most importantly, we're going to uncover the profound, world-changing lesson they learned from it all.
All right, let's begin. We start with one man on one specific day, a day that changes absolutely everything. This is the moment where that personal, human experience crashes headlong into an unbelievable, overwhelming new reality. Now, to really get this, you have to understand who wrote these words. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke. This guy was a decorated ace, a hero, a man who believed he was one of the eagles of the sky. So put yourself in his cockpit. He looks up and sees 291 B-17 flying fortresses, just flowing toward Germany like a force of nature. But you know what was truly terrifying for him? It wasn't just the sheer number. It was the sudden, chilling realization that this massive force, this was just a fraction of what the enemy had. And behind him, every single German fighter they could get into the air was already there with him. There were no reserves. This was it. And in that one moment, his whole world flips upside down. He understood. They weren't the eagles anymore. He wrote in his diary, "We are insects."
So how in the world do you get to a point where a battle-hardened ace, a hero, feels like an insect? Well, the answer isn't really found in the skies over Germany. It's found on the factory floors, thousands of miles away. This is where the warrior's spirit comes up against the brutal, cold, unfeeling logic of industrial production.
Okay, look at this chart. This is the heart of the matter. The crucial thing to see here isn't just the numbers, it's the gap. And it's the word theoretical next to the German number. For every single fighter that Germany could hope to produce in a perfect month, and that 1600 number was basically a fantasy, America was actually, consistently, rolling out nearly 3 times that. It's not just bringing a knife to a gunfight. It's like your opponent has a machine gun that's hooked up directly to an ammo factory and it never ever runs out. They were fighting a war of attrition where the other side had a seemingly infinite supply of everything.
And if you want to understand the pace of this thing, this number says it all. I mean, just stop and think about that. One B-24 heavy bomber, not one a day, one every 63 minutes, all day, all night, nonstop. A brand new 4-engine heavy bomber was rolling off the line before the crew from the last one had even finished their coffee break. This wasn't just a factory. It was a conveyor belt of destruction. It was an industrial force of nature that you just couldn't fight.
And you know, this massive gap, it wasn't just in the machines. It was in the men who were flying them. Think about it as a tale of 2 pilots. The American kid shows up to his squadron with over 200 hours of flight time. And more importantly, 75 of those hours are in the actual fighter plane he's going to fly in combat. He knows it inside and out. Now his German counterpart, if he's lucky, he has half the total flight time. And maybe 20 hours in his Messerschmitt because they were dealing with crippling fuel shortages. So how can you honestly expect a young man who can barely land his own plane to survive, let alone fight against a pilot who has 10 times his experience in that specific aircraft? You can't.
And this is where it gets really tragic. We're moving from the cold, hard production numbers to the warm bodies being sent up into the sky. This is the exact point where statistics become a human tragedy.
This quote, it's just absolutely damning. And listen, this isn't some disgruntled pilot just complaining. This is Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautluft. He was the inspector of day fighters. It was literally his job to know the truth of the situation, and he was stating a cold, hard fact to his superiors. These young men weren't reinforcements. They were children, sent up in high-performance killing machines they could barely control, sent up against the best-trained, best-equipped pilots in the world. They were, in his own devastating words, not pilots, they were victims.
And it gets worse. Even the few planes they had, they often couldn't even fly. Just look at this logistical collapse.
In January of 44, 2/3 of their fighters were ready to go. By July, just 6 months later, it's less than 1 in 5. The Luftwaffe wasn't just being shot out of the sky, it was being starved to death on the ground. The Allied bombing campaign was systematically cutting its lifeblood. They hit the spare parts factories, the ball bearing plants, and critically, the synthetic fuel plants. The Luftwaffe's wings were being clipped before it ever even left the runway.
So now, let's turn to the psychological impact. What does this all do to the veterans, the aces who saw this happening day after day? For them, this wasn't a fight anymore. They began to feel like they were just part of a systematic industrial process of annihilation.
Just let those words from Hauptmann Robert Weiss sink in for a moment. He wrote them in a letter the night before he was killed in action. 6 planes. They had 6 planes ready to fly against a force of 800 bombers and 600 escort fighters, 1,400 enemy aircraft. This was an ace, a man with 121 confirmed victories. He knew war like few others. And he said, this isn't it. The word he chose, execution. It perfectly captures that feeling of absolute helplessness, of facing an overwhelming, impersonal force that is simply there to erase you.
And here it is. This is the single sentence that defines the entire conflict from their perspective. General Adolf Galland, the commander of Germany's entire fighter force, said this directly to Hitler's face. He saw the fundamental terrifying truth of the situation. It was no longer pilot versus pilot. It was no longer Messerschmitt versus Mustang. It was Germany's entire warrior tradition against the full might of American industry, put on wings and sent across the ocean.
Let's just look at the final brutal numbers for that 1 year, 1944. The total numbers are lopsided enough, right? Over double. But the truly mind-breaking number is on that second line, heavy bombers. The U.S. produced 35,000 of them. Let me put that into perspective for you. In that single year, the United States built more 4-engine heavy bombers than the entire German Air Force had planes of all types at the very start of the war. They weren't just fighting a different war. At that point, they were fighting on a different planet.
So what happens when the fighting finally stops and the dust settles? You know, this might be the most surprising part of the whole story. The conclusion isn't just about defeat. It's about a profound transformation, a new understanding that was born from witnessing this incredible, awesome power firsthand.
This came from a secret recording of a captured German general. He didn't know anyone was listening. And he sums it up perfectly. The accountants won. That is a stunning admission. It's a recognition that the nature of modern war had changed forever, right before their eyes. It wasn't just about bravery or honor or tactics anymore. It was about logistics, production quotas, and supply chains. They were beating not by a better soldier, but by a better system. And this brings us to the deepest lesson of all, one articulated by men like Johannes Steinhoff. He was a top Luftwaffe ace who survived the war and later helped build the new German Air Force. Years later, speaking to American cadets, he explained what he had finally come to understand. He told them, America didn't just win because it had more factories or more resources. It won because of the system that mobilized those resources. Free workers in Detroit, motivated by a sense of purpose, completely and utterly outproduced the slave labor being used in Nazi factories. Free enterprise and competition out-innovated and outmaneuvered rigid state control. The real power, he realized, wasn't just the factory itself. It was the freedom that fueled it.
And with that, we arrive at the most powerful conclusion you could imagine. Steinhoff argued that America's true victory wasn't found in the rubble of Berlin. It was found in what came next: the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Germany as a democratic ally, the creation of NATO as a shield against Soviet expansion. The power to produce such destruction was awesome, he realized, but the wisdom to use that same power to rebuild, to transform a bitter enemy into a lasting friend, well, that was the true victory.
So we're left with this question, right? Is the factory more powerful than the front line? The experience of the Luftwaffe gives us a pretty sobering answer. They learned, the hardest way possible, that individual courage and incredible skill can be completely overwhelmed by an avalanche of industrial output. It's a lesson that forces us all to think about where a nation's true strength really comes from. And it's a question that is every bit as relevant today as it was in the skies over Germany in 1944. What truly makes a nation powerful? Something to think about.